Okay, right, well, welcome to this week's lecture, in fact this week and next week's lecture. As you remember, last week we did parties and party politics, and indeed the previous 2 weeks. This week we're going to look at the role of the media in British government and politics, and to do that we have speaking Professor Charlie Beckett, who is the head of the Department of Media and Communications here at the LSE and the founder of Polis. Perhaps you could say a word about Polis before you start, but I'll hand over to you, Charlie, perhaps for sort of an hour, and then we'll take some questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Tony. It's always a pleasure to be here because the interactions with the government department are always profitable, I find. Before I came to the LSE, I was a journalist for 25 odd years, and a lot of my journalism was political. I was never a Westminster a lobby journalist, but from my beginnings on the South London Press during the famous 1980s so-called loony left councils of South London, I was in there, and then went to work for the BBC, including on the BBC's programme On the Record, which doesn't even exist anymore. But it featured colleagues there were people like John Rentoul, Martha Carney, and of course Michael Gove, who's gone on to even greater things. And then latterly I was at Channel 4 News, which those of you who watch British terrestrial television knows is a slightly alternative public service 1-hour news programme every evening. So I come from a very mainstream journalism background, and as Tony alluded to, 8 years ago I came to the LSE to set up the think tank called Polis. I didn't choose the name. It was a classical allusion by the late great Professor Roger Silverstone, because the idea of Polis is that it's about journalism and society. Most of my work actually in the period I've been here has been around media change, how journalism has changed for all sorts of reasons, and is changing, of course. And next week I'll be looking much more at that. But I've also been looking at, if you like, new forms of political journalism, such as my last book was about WikiLeaks and its kind of significance for political communication. But today I'm going to look much more at the mainstream political journalism in relation to mainstream politics. And one of the nice things about this, as Tony said, there's a double dose of me, I'm afraid. So I've got 2 weeks to have a run at this. So it's a good chance to try and go back, as John Major famously said, to basics, back to basics, and try and take a sort of a longer run up to the idea of contemporary political journalism. And in this lecture, to perhaps give a bit more context and background, and then next week perhaps to get into the more contentious meat of it. But I want to start, can you all see that at the back there? Can you see that one? How many people know this painting? It's actually housed across the way, wherever that is, across Lincoln's Inn Fields, in the Sir John Soane Museum. Somebody, and you're just looking at it, what does it tell you? What do you think it's about? Come on, you've got eyes and mouths, tell me, what do you think? Your first impression looking at that?
People revolting against the king or something?
Yeah, kind of revolt. Immediately, it's interesting that you immediately start thinking politically. Yeah, there's something political going on here, a kind of revolt, possibly, definitely disorder. Anything else? Anybody else? No? What do you think? Good, bad? What do you feel? Have you seen the painting? Tell me. Pardon?
I don't really know what to say. Kind of, riot, things are not going as planned.
Yeah, things not going as planned. Very, very good.
There's a mob in the background there, for those who can't see it, a huge mob in the background with sticks and pikes and things.
Yeah. And this thing is actually packed full of meaning. It's called Chairing of the Member. It was painted by Hogarth in 1754, which was a general election year in England. And this is one of a sequence of 4 paintings. I think this is the last one. So this is the victorious Tory MP. And what's happened is his supporters, as they carry him around, have bumped into the vanquished Whig supporters. And as you say, things start to go wrong. There's mayhem. And as you see it, it's packed full of details. You know he's a Tory, for example, because we can't see it at all clearly, but he's got blue ribbons, apparently. And then you start to see various other things going on. The pigs, those of you who know your Bible, Gadarene swine. And the people up here are actually Whigs. And then, of course, there's all sorts of classic allusions, flying ducks or something. There's a sewer here. There's a monkey, bizarrely, with a rifle. And this skull and crossbones is supposed to be an allusion to Sir Isaac Newton, who that was his kind of family emblem or something. And the idea is that, you see, the chimney sweeps have put glasses over his eyes. And apparently that's supposed to be a reference to the idea that reason is being unsighted in contemporary 18th century politics. So it's a scene of great richness. And I would argue that it's very much political journalism. This is reporting, although it's mainly comment. Most of those, that would be a very recognisable scene. Obviously it's condensed and it's rich and dramatic, but that would be a very recognisable scene and a very recognisable set of references and symbols and formulae that would have spoken hugely, subtly, as well as quite obviously, that people can you immediately picked up on the fact there's a kind of political disruption going on here. And yet this is supposed to be, the flower of English democracy. This is supposed to be the moment of great rationalism and, the nation state expressing itself politically. And Oliver Goldsmith, who was writing about elections at exactly the same time, said, quote, "The merits of a candidate are often measured by the number of his treats. His constituents assemble, eat upon him and lend their applause, not to his integrity of sense, but the quantities of his beef and brandy." What lies behind this is a great sense that Hogarth felt that British, or English rather, politics was deeply corrupt. So, you don't understand it because you, of course, are not 18th century English people. You're not able to interpret. But it does show you that all journalism is formulae. It's limited by space, by time, and by the attention that you're able to pay to it. It is literally limited, the sense of space that you've got in a painting to get your ideas across, very much akin to the limits on the space that a journalist might have in a newspaper. It also tells us that journalism changes over time, stylistically, technically, socially, culturally, and ideologically. And finally, it also shows us that scandal and corruption is, of course, nothing new, and that 18th century elections were probably a lot more fun than 21st century elections.
And satire's not new either.
And satire's not new. I think that perhaps the nearest you might get to this would be perhaps Steve Bell, Martin Lawson, people like that. So, in these 2 lectures, I'm going to try and set out the relationship between journalism and politics as I see it, the way that it's changed and is changing, new trends in political communications and their potential impact on UK democracy, and at the heart of it, the kind of problems or problematics of mainstream politics and mainstream journalism. So to do that, I'm going to try, as I said, to get back to some basics about political journalism and perhaps some basics about the kind of historical context. And obviously the first thing that, especially politicians always ask is, why do we need journalism for democracy? It provides you with information, facts, records, Hansard, for example, statistics, usually falsified, but and most journalists are famously innumerate. Tells you about events, tells you when stuff happens. David Cameron is up to his knees in floodwater as we speak. Gives you information about policies. Then deliberation is what we'd call what you were talking about, the idea of argument. And that can be in the form of debate, analysis, expert or otherwise, comment, and opinion to allow people, yes, to argue, a forum, if you like. And then finally, accountability. Political journalists can investigate what politicians are doing. They can audit, they can they can say, well, hang on a minute, Nick Clegg, you said this before the election, and then you said something completely different afterwards, repeatedly. You can campaign, you can try and change what politicians are doing, and you can act as a voice for the citizen, which is, any number of newspapers have that as their slogans under their banners. So in that sense, journalism is, if you like, to use the metaphor, a kind of library for democracy. It's a theatre for democracy. And finally, it's a watchdog for democracy. That, of course, is the ideal. And in terms of political economy, that's been represented constitutionally as this idea of the fourth estate. Anybody know what the other three are when Burke was talking about it? No? What were the other three estates?
Church?
Nearly?
Executive?
No? Not quite. He was talking about the Parliament, the three estates of Parliament, actually. Yeah, I think it's the French one, isn't it? The French one is the Church and the King and something else, the Commons. The three estates in Parliament are the Lords, spiritual, temporal, and the Commons. Do you not teach this stuff anymore, Tony?
It has been, we have done this, but not quite in this way. I mean,
No.
in fairness, we learned about this, but not as estates in this sense. So.
Yeah. I'd never thought about it until recently. The idea of the fourth estate has become such a cliche that we forget the other ones. And of course, like most of the British Constitution and like much of journalism history, this is a myth, something of a myth anyway. No one's very sure if Burke ever said this at all. There's no real proper record that he did. But it's definitely how politicians and journalists, when they do think about their relationship, how they like to conceive of their relationship. And we'll see in the next lecture how we might actually now be able to talk about a fifth estate. Now, of course, there are other models available. The most popular model of the relationship between politicians and journalists around the world is the authoritarian model, by far the most popular, where journalism is directly or indirectly controlled by the state. Generally speaking, politicians like this model. It simplifies things greatly. And then, of course, within Europe, there are also very different traditions and structures that reflect the political and social context of those countries, as well as the peculiar histories they might have. And in very simple, London-centred, cliched terms, these would be described as Northern Europe, where political journalism tends towards a kind of objective model. Then as you head south to warmer climes, the journalism becomes far more partisan, and you end up with the kind of corrupt party or state-funded political media that you might get somewhere like Italy. And of course the French, as we've seen recently, and this is very much the Westminster view, of course the French have their unique blend of business models for political journalism, where newspapers are indeed subsidised by presidential decree. And by a complete coincidence, journalists don't ask questions about the president's love life. Now, of course, in Britain the system is hardly perfect. And I spend a lot of my time here at the LSE explaining to international journalists or politicians and academics why we in the UK have such a strange political journalism culture, where you can have politicians who, on the one hand, hack into politicians' phones, and then those same journalists go horse riding with them. So before we go to the future, though, let's have a quick look back at the past. And when I think about political media history in Britain, it's very much a constant struggle between authority, especially politicians, but also civil servants and so on, and journalists for kind of control over information and the opinion agenda. Now, just very quickly, these are all local examples. These are all from around the LSE, which finds itself at the heart of the nexus of political journalism history. Here, the Inns of Court arguably is where political journalism starts. If you're a relatively modern medieval monarch, when you go abroad to France to sort of kick ass over there, when you come back, you want to let people know what you've been doing, and particularly you want to let the court know what you've been doing, and the nobility, so they finance your next jaunt. And so you get a class of clerks hired from the Inns of Court to help disseminate that information, which is, if you like, the kind of political court news service. Then you start to get developing around Holborn and Fleet Street the printers. Caxton moves over, or rather Caxton doesn't move over. Caxton's sidekick, Vicken van der Verde, who was of course an immigrant, sets up the first printing press down by St Bride's in Fleet Street, and publishes, actually most of the stuff he publishes is kind of popular press. It's popular kind of verse and pamphlets. So the tabloid press was born very early, but from that spreads a whole industry for printing. You then get across the road in Covent Garden in the 17th century and 18th century. You get the coffee house culture, where people coming from the trading houses and the stock exchange, meeting with Westminster political type people and court people, and you get people like Defoe and Swift starting to, as well as writing marvellous novels, doing a lot of political pamphleteering and hack work, much of it published by the printers that grew up around here. And then finally you get the growth of the Fleet Street national newsrooms. Now, that street obviously deserted, but at one point the centre of, almost uniquely really in Europe, the centre of a whole national press in one street, with their offices just down the road in Westminster. And that whole structure becomes possible because of mass education, therefore mass literacy in the 19th century, combined with mass transport of railways, which means that you can have a daily press market, plus new technologies for journalism, such as the telegraph, which means that you can have reporting from places like the Crimean War instantly published in the Times, and having a direct impact within days upon parliamentary debates about the conduct of that war, for example. And then in the final phase in the 20th century, you get the growth again. You can see it around here with the BBC's, formerly the BBC's Bush House, the growth of broadcasting, public broadcasting in that sense, but also commercial broadcasting across the Thames. You can see what used to be a London Weekend Television Tower, where I also worked for a brief period. So you get the growth of broadcasting alongside the newspapers. And so you have this vast expansion of journalism into a huge sector of the economy as a business, as an entertainment, and of course, vitally, especially newspapers, as a political vehicle for the proprietors as well. And the relationship between that press and Parliament formalised with the growth of the parliamentary lobby, where journalists actually have to become accredited to be allowed to be able to report upon the doings of Parliament itself. And next week, we've even got slightly down the road, I suppose, in Old Street, Tech City, which is another chapter, if you like, in the way that media has evolved here in the centre of London. And the story perhaps reaches its apogee with the 2010 elections in the UK, when all the party leaders agree to join the 20th century and be part of the TV election debates. Now, these ended up don't know how many people here were here for the 2010 UK election. Not everyone, okay. It was about our most exciting election for a long time, if only because the result was somewhat in doubt. It was a relatively, well, so close we ended up with a coalition. So it was one of those remarkable occasions where the campaign does actually matter. The 3-4 week campaign actually mattered. And that coincided with these TV election debates, which partly because of their novelty, you know, backward countries like the USA have been having these for 50 years, but we only just managed to get round to it by mistake, I think, because it was Gordon Brown, wasn't he? He was so far behind in the polls, they agreed to do a TV debate. And then the polls closed and he realised it was a bit of a mistake, but it was too late by then. Now, how much impact they had is debatable. They certainly appeared. You can just see it just by the topography of that Nick Clegg, the Lib Dems, suddenly find themselves being given literally equal stature with the other two parties, and Clegg came across to a sort of, as a novelty, if you like, partly to the British public. And the polls did seem to react to those TV debates in the short term. But ultimately, of course, it's very difficult to separate out, you know, the media effects in the short term about how much impact they had. But this was, you know, it wasn't exactly the revolution televised, but that moment when the British the greatest political decision is made by the British people about who governs them, very much felt like a television-centric event. It was remarkable that millions of people did tune in for what were 90-minute sessions, very crunchy, policy-orientated sessions. On the other hand, most of the research so far has not shown us that many people changed their views, or even that they felt particularly better informed. And certainly there wasn't much of an impact on the ratings of other programmes on at the same time, such as Coronation Street. So that's the history. What's the problem? Is there a problem with British political media, with the role of the media in politics today? Does anybody think there is a problem? Or do you all think it's absolutely marvellous? Anybody want to hazard?
Makes them very guarded how they speak, politicians.
That's interesting, yeah. The British political journalism are very inhibiting. Any others?
They're very selective. They're quite picky about the kind of stories they choose to run.
How do you mean? Keep going.
For example, GM food at the moment is being served in the supermarkets, and they didn't run any kind of a thing about it, even though it was very controversial in the papers a few years ago. And now there's elements of GM and things. The papers didn't run anything about it.
Yeah, very sort of selective agenda. Yeah. Anything else? Anything else that gets you mad about the media?
Journalists tend to have a very narrow points of view. It tends to be a sort of white middle class perspective.
Yeah, it's a lack of diversity. Yeah. Anything else that gets you cross about journalism?
There's a real but an awful lot of power, just consolidation into small to big.
Yeah.
It seems to influence politics, disproportionately.
So power and concentrated power, yeah. Lack of plurality, I suppose, yeah. Anything else gets you cross? You're obviously very cross, you've got
Depending, you're often not knowledgeable about what they're writing about, especially in something like GM or science-based stuff.
ignorant, yeah. Anything else?
Exaggeration sometimes.
Exaggeration sometimes? All the time, yeah. Anything else? Sorry, there's a moment on here, sorry.
They can kind of create moral panics and trigger knee-jerk reactions among policymakers, which isn't always a good thing.
Any examples?
Dangerous dogs.
Yeah. Although not a good example today, is it?
Mm.
Another kid's been killed. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. Or immigration is another one,
Yeah.
perhaps.
I think that Robert Peston with his blog, it caused like a bank run on Northern Rock, some people say.
Why was that a bad thing?
Maybe it wasn't, but sometimes like by putting in the media's eye, you can, as you said, cause panic, which could be avoided.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, they look after the vested interests as well, don't they? So, for example, with the libel scandal, a lot of money's been taken from the British public, but they just won't talk about quantifying it. No one talks about sterling libel being rigged and the mortgages that the local authorities and the skimming of trillions. It's just not referred to. I mean, and then that permits captured regulators like the FCA to be able to not pursue fraud.
Okay. Anybody else at the back? Want to add to the litany of... It's all right, keep going. It's not supposed to be. Anyway, I think that list definitely touches a lot of kind of familiar bases. I think that often it kind of depends where you stand. You, of course, are all objective. Well, I don't know if you are all objective academics. Other people may have crept in, but I think it also partly depends where you stand. So, for example, politicians, and I talk to politicians a lot, have done over the years, still do, would probably have a list something like this: the unaccountable power of the press, which I think you alluded to there, the fact that you can at least theoretically vote a politician out, but harder to get rid of Rupert Murdoch, certainly harder to get rid of Richard Desmond as a majority shareholder. The idea of bias generally, some more subtle, the obsession with process. Politicians complain that journalists never want to talk about the big picture and the policies. They just want to talk about who's up and who's down, kind of horse race reporting. Somebody else mentioned cynicism, I think, that there is a sort of erosion of kind of idealism and confidence in politics and democracy if you constantly do. Does everyone know the famous quote from Jeremy Paxman about what goes through his mind? Jeremy Paxman, who presents Newsnight, the flagship BBC political programme, and the thought he said once anyway, that always goes through his head before he's about to interview a politician, which is, why is this lying bastard lying to me? Then there's the lack of information. Yeah, a couple of people mentioned that or less a lack of expertise. That journalists rarely know what they're talking about. And then there's particular ones, I think Tony would hear this a lot, about structural problems currently with loss of local press. Local newspapers are closing, losing resource, and that means that MPs have nowhere to put their press releases about their local constituencies. If you talk to journalists, their problem with political journalism, well, actually their main complaint about political journalism at the moment is that there's no time to go drinking, that you don't get much time for lunches anymore. But more seriously, they would certainly complain about lack of resources, and by that I mean the number of them doing this, the amount of time that they have to do their journalism, and the lack of resource for research, backup, fact checking, that kind of thing. And that's obviously partly a function of the increasing speed of the political news cycle, but also the economic crisis within mainstream journalism. Journalists would also complain very much about continuing government secrecy, although in many ways this has improved. It's the one thing that Tony Blair regrets most, he said, about his spell in government, was that he brought in freedom of information requests, so that journalists have a right to, or anybody has a right to, request information from the executive. Then, of course, journalists complain about government and party spin and manipulation. From spin doctors, the release of information, etc. And then finally, they complain about it's an ugly word, but disintermediation, which is basically the idea that journalists used to be the conduit between politics, politicians and the government and the public, and that increasingly they're being cut out of that relationship, that stream. That increasingly the public, damn them, are able to go straight to some government website and get the information for themselves, or they're able to go to other places, blogs and social networks, for example, if they want to have a conversation about politics. They don't need the journalists anymore, and that's led to, or one of the things that's partly led to a growth in public relations around this. That if you want to get your message across as a lobby group or as a politician, increasingly you can turn to these other channels, these other networks, rather than having to go through the journalists. There's a little sense of feeling bypassed. The public's problem with political journalism, I think, is much more complex. And I think pretty much all the things you said in the selective list that you gave, I would agree with, as it were, but you could also make a converse claim. How else would you have found out about the LIBOR scandal except for a journalist? How would you have found out about or paid attention to that scandal, that kind of scandal, unless some journalist had made it sexy and sensationalist and screamed at you that it mattered? So frequently the public, and this is the most common complaint, especially when you think about the complexity of life generally. Think about the floods. In a way, the flood story is a bloody simple story. My house is drowning. On the other hand, we all know it's an incredibly complicated story. Is it dredging? Is it climate change? What's the best way to deal with it? Let alone whose fault it is. And so if you try and tell that story in its full richness, people are just going to give up on you. On the other hand, people say, yeah, it's too simplistic. It's too simplistic to blame Chris Smith for the flooding. So again, there's contradictory problematic there. People complain that journalists are much too cynical. As I said, the Jeremy Paxman attitude, but more generally, an assumption always that politicians have got malevolent, selfish interests, that generally speaking, people are always acting because of money and self-interest and so on. And yet, on the other hand, and I think this was one or two people were sort of suggesting this, that journalists aren't critical enough, that they're much too complicit. They assume that if they're told that Enron is a terrific idea for a business, then surely it must be. If everyone else is saying it is, then let's go along with that, the groupthink idea. So again, there's a real tension there. Journalists are criticised for being too belligerent and biased, and yet, as I say, they're also said to be not radical enough or too complicit. And again, how often, perhaps you're all intelligent people who care about current affairs, so you may even be the kind of people who settle down, rubbing your hands to listen to the Radio 4 news at 10 o'clock of an evening. But most people will describe politics and political journalism as boring. And therefore, if you try and make it interesting, on the other hand, you're criticised as being sensationalist and focusing on personalities. And then my favourite, of course, is the one that I constantly go on about. I always say, God, British journalists were always living in a kind of Westminster bubble, that literally, the journalists live and work, they work right in the same place alongside the offices of the MPs, and the MPs themselves seem to spend an inordinate amount of time in Millbank, for example, talking to the BBC. And yet, there's also and I think a lot of the stuff that the government department have done with the Institute of Government and so on, has shown that there's a real sense that journalists are not properly informed enough about the realities of policy making. And I think your point about inhibition comes in there, where the executives say it's impossible for us to make proper policy, because every time we try and do something, every time we float an idea, one newspaper or another will panic, moral panic, will sensationalise based on ignorance, because they're so frightened that there may be change, and that it's therefore impossible to have evidence-based, deliberative policy making under those conditions. So lots of contradictory complaints from the public, if you like, which doesn't mean that they're wrong. So let's try and sort of think about how it plays out in reality. This is, do people know what this is? The Sun newspaper. You ever seen the Sun newspaper? Terrific paper. Still Britain's best-selling daily newspaper, with far more left-wing Labour supporting readers than The Guardian, far more AB1 readers than The Telegraph, simply because, of course, it sells so many copies. And this is from 1992, when there was a remarkable, I think Tony would agree, unexpected victory for John Major. And I don't know if you can see it, but this was the last edition of The Sun, had a picture of the Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, as a light bulb, saying, you know, that will the last person, if Kinnock wins today, will the last person to leave Britain please turn out the lights? And they claimed that this, in a very narrow election, had swung, that people had gone into the ballot box, and on their retina was burnt this image of this, you know, rather loud, shouty, ginger Welsh person who was going to tax them more, and that was horrid. There's actually very little psephological evidence that this was the case, that people had changed their mind ages before. So again, not much evidence of a direct impact, but I think it is very true to say that the newspaper press, because they're allowed to be partisan in a way that broadcasters are not, does at least help frame, you know, very important media concept, that they don't dictate the details of a policy or an agenda, but they help frame that agenda. Now, the example I'd give, for example, is how hard it is in this country for a Labour politician to use the word socialist. In France and Germany, it's very routine for left-wing politicians to say, yeah, I'm socialist, and they're not particularly any more socialist than Ed Miliband, but they use that word. It's almost forbidden now. There's a kind of McCarthyite taboo on using that word. Another example, though, which shows how loose that framing is Euroscepticism. We are all now cognizant of the fact that the British press are largely, rabidly, Eurosceptic. But they have actually been that way for some time. And if it did have an effect on the British public, it took a long while, and I would argue actually probably followed in the lee of British public opinion, and certainly British politicians were very slow to pick up on it. So it's a very loose relationship, this idea of press power. But also we've seen over the last 20 years how political presentation has become much more professionalised. And so politicians themselves are also learning how to frame those agendas and learning how to connect with the public, even pre-internet. Does anybody recognise who that cow is? Sexist. I think the irony of this is that, of course, John Selwyn Gummer, do you know what he's famous for? Anybody know what he's really famous? Former agriculture minister.
Yeah, the burger.
Yeah, during the foot and mouth cattle crisis in Britain, he famously ate a hamburger and gave one to his daughter to prove that British beef was safe. So that's why the calf looks so worried. But this is, and Mrs. Thatcher, of course, with Tim Bell, was a pioneer. By no means the first. Goes right back Howard Wilson and beyond, but pioneered this idea of framing it. And I remember when I was working at the BBC in this period, there was actually a serious discussion about whether you should cover this kind of stunt. Why would you cover a candidate holding a cow? Of what policy significance is this? We said in our earnest way. And 10 minutes later, we were sending a crew out to go and cover the stunt, of course. And now it would be impossible. I cannot think of a single moment. Sorry, I can only think of one single moment in the last general election that wasn't entirely choreographed. Does anybody know the one moment I'm thinking of in the 2010 British election?
Was it Mrs. Duffy?
Yeah, Mrs. Duffy. Yeah, that stupid woman. That bigoted woman. That bigoted woman. Of course, you only knew about that because Gordon Brown had left his microphone on when he got into his car. And so, political presentation from politicians has now become completely professionalised, and indeed journalists are now entirely complicit in it. Another point on this voyage of discovery about how political journalism has evolved and the role of the media has evolved, of course, reaches its apogee or nadir with Alistair Campbell under Tony Blair, where on the one hand you have pages. You probably don't remember pages, anybody under 30 anyway, but pages for MPs telling them what to think all the time, little bleeps going off telling them the latest line. And where did that come from? Did it come from the Whip's office? No, it came from Alistair Campbell. And somebody like Alistair, who has indeed taught in my department, became as powerful as anybody in the cabinet, alongside the late, great Philip Gould, who was also a professor in my department. You may be spotting a trend here. And people like Peter Mandelson and so on, who of course was an elected politician. That those people were powerful within the cabinet, and partly, as Campbell writes in his diaries, in reaction to that Neil Kinnock front page that I showed you. The sense was we must never let that happen again. We must never let the press be able to attack Labour and jeopardise our electoral chances in that way again. And that was why Campbell brought in this extraordinarily efficient system, the grid system, the messaging system to control what his MP said, and also an extraordinary ability to bully, intimidate and manipulate journalists, as much by carrot, offering them leaks, offering them unofficial briefings, often on other Labour politicians, in return for their collaboration generally on them trying to shape the political agenda. And of course, coalition government in some ways has changed the terms of trade. It's made it harder, just simply the fact of coalition government has made it harder for journalists to focus on splits, for example. And at the same time, there has been an increase in open data, for example, from the executive. But as we saw with the whole relationship between the so-called Chipping-Norton set, the relationship between Cameron supporters and News International, the political and journalistic ruling classes were still kind of locked in an embrace based on a kind of mutual attraction for power. So, what did the biggest ever inquiry into British journalism, the Lord Leveson inquiry, make of the role of the media in democracy? Well, I should have explained, that's what he's referring to. When Leveson says that the politicians developed too close a relationship with the press in a way which has not been in the public interest, he was referring to this, the idea that you could have a prime minister who goes horse riding with the editor of, which by then she was the chief executive of News International, and that they're texting each other very jollily over the weekends. He felt was them getting much too close. Does everyone know the joke about LOL? Famously came out in the Leveson inquiry that, let's get this right, she was signing off her messages LOL, or putting LOL in her messages, and Cameron kept sending them back thinking it meant lots of love. And of course it means laugh out loud. So that was Leveson's main complaint, was that it was the politicians who had become much too close a relationship with the press, based on exactly the same way that Tony Blair had flown to a News International conference in Australia to try and keep on side with Murdoch, the same way that Gordon Brown had an extremely close relationship with Paul Dacre of the Daily Mail, and indeed why Ed Miliband went to any number of News International Christmas parties until the phone hacking inquiry started. And in fact, his judgment on journalism overall is a catalogue of complaint. And I highly recommend that you go and have a look at the Leveson Inquiry website. If you can bear it, try and read some of the report, because it's a treasure trove of evidence based on forensic interviews with journalists and politicians that puts on the record how British journalism really works in practice. But his judgment on political journalism was interesting, that he felt it was in robust good health and performing the vital public interest functions in a vigorous democracy. So you're all wrong, all you people who are complaining about journalism. Lord Leveson says it's fine, okay? So, he may have a point in that, and I don't think he would frame it entirely like this, but this is the sort of paradox of the so-called crisis that politics and journalism faces. And Simon Jenkins, who's a veteran journalist, was the editor of the Times and the Evening Standard. This was written in The Guardian, though, where he says that the unshackled and irresponsible press sometimes gets it wrong, but I still prefer it warts and all to a shackled and responsible one. And this is the paradox of British political journalism. The paradox is that the very qualities of political journalism that people criticise are also its virtues. And to understand that, we have to remember that journalists, very much like politicians, of course, carry out a very imperfect trade, that they both is an ideological and executive profession. It's not a science. It's certainly not an academic process. Both journalists and politicians have, of course, ideological baggage. They have positions. They have personal biases, and biases in every sense, including their ignorance about things. And yet they are an executive profession. Politicians have to get on and make democracy work. They have to make government work. Journalists have to get journalism made. And so inevitably both, as I say, are imperfect in their results. In terms of the kind of mutual hostility, it is, of course, very good that the public are sceptical about both politicians and journalists. And it is certainly vital, I'd argue, that there should be a lot of tension in the relationship between politicians and journalists. Journalists need to be able to represent the full range of public opinion, and by that I don't just mean from left to right. I talk in my first book about editorial diversity. Somebody else mentioned a lack of other diversity, I can't remember who it was, white middle class bit. That's certainly one of the problems, and that journalists, senior journalists in Britain, especially political journalists, all seem to be PPE Oxford graduates, apart from me. And they certainly seem to be drawn, from a particular class. That's why, for example, stories about house prices going up are always a good thing in British newspapers, and mortgage rates going down is always a great thing. It's because they've all got huge mortgages, and that's why they're also worried about the 50p tax rate, because they're some of the few people who might actually end up paying it. Yet there's a much greater problem, I would argue, about editorial diversity. And this isn't just a kind of left-right thing, although I think that is part of it. And one of the interesting things we're going to see with, for example, the Glenn Greenwald's, his new journalistic venture, will be just how many people want to occupy that niche. But it's a broader sense of how journalists have to try and represent public opinion, even when it's irrational, when it's emotional, when it's personal, when it's particular to a particular region or an interest, when it's quite illogical. And the reason they should do that is because that's very much the nature of democracy as well. That democracy is also about emotion, about the particular, about the personal, and about the irrational. Journalists need to be able to test ideas, not just in a laboratory, but in that human social context. They have to be able to test those ideas, I'd argue, even to destruction. Their job is not to create policy. That's always the worst moment. Start worrying whenever you see a newspaper or TV show start to say, this is what you should be doing. It's where journalists are least competent. And so, in a broader ethical sense, journalists need to be able to be wrong. They need to get things out of proportion, out of context. And they even need to be able to do things which are, strictly speaking, ethical, even illegal. And the easy example I'd give you would be MPs' expenses. Famous scandal a few years ago in Britain, which we laughingly refer to things like the duck house that one MP claimed on his expenses. But they were serious. People went to jail. Politicians went to jail for stealing tens of thousands of pounds from the British taxpayer. It was, by any standard, a real scandal. And yet, those parliamentarians fought tooth and nail to stop that story coming out. They even tried to change the law so that the information could not be released. And indeed, to start with, the British media was pretty complicit and failed to act. Journalists found it quite hard to think in terms of, that guy who buys me lunch or that guy I buy lunch, well, that's just expenses. Journalists haven't got a great track record on clean expense claims, notoriously so, in fact, so they hardly occupy the moral high ground when it comes to expenses. But it was eventually a conservative newspaper, The Telegraph, helped by people like the information campaigner Heather Brooks, who eventually published that information and that story, which had a profound impact on public attitudes to MPs and so on, but also the way that Parliament worked. But of course, that information was illegally obtained. It was information that was stolen, just like Ed Snowden. And to make it worse, the Telegraph paid a shed load of money. I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was £60,000 to somebody for that illegally obtained information. But of course, no one, I think now, really questions that that was in the public interest. So that, I think, is the paradox of political mainstream journalism. So, is there a problem? Well, one might be trust, and yet, funny enough, the trust figures for both politicians and journalists, I know absolutely they're not great. The purple one is journalists, the green one is politicians. It's not great compared to, bloody doctors. Everyone loves doctors, don't they? The doctors are doing, everyone trusts doctors to tell the truth. It's always been low. But the point, 2 points really. One is that, funny enough, it's creeping back up again. That's interesting. I don't know why that might be. It's creeping back up again, but frankly, it's always been that way. That journalists and politicians have never been formally trusted in that explicit way by the public. And if anyone's got a problem, here's an interesting sidebar issue. Look at the clergy. What's happened there? They really got a trust problem. But anyway, so I don't think it's about trust. I think the real problem for political journalism is this. I think it's about engagement and attention and authenticity. And I'll talk a bit more about that in detail in the next lecture. But the point is that here, I think politicians and journalists mainstream journalists very much share a problem, which is that the public are increasingly, and I know the previous lectures have dealt with this to some degree, that the public increasingly do not want to be involved in mainstream party politics. Party membership is declining, slowly at least, over the long term. Voting is declining. And certainly the number of people who are prepared to pay for mainstream news media, boy, that's really declining. But again, it's been happening for a long time, and I think it's very much a parallel set of figures with politics. So I think the argument, and in many ways the criticism that some of you raised before, was in a sense you were criticising the authority of journalists, you know, whether they got things right, whether they knew stuff, whether they represented people, you know. So it's, do they have the authority to speak for people? But I think the problem for politicians and journalists is not just that, and not even that in a way, but it's much more the attention. Have they lost the attention of the public? And I think in that sense, that's one of the arguments why, and they've lost the attention of the public for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are rather good. I think that anybody who is obsessed by Westminster politics has got a problem, or at least is different. You know, the idea that everybody should be deeply obsessed by it in the way that perhaps I am, and perhaps some of you are, that's unusual. You know, it's really unusual to have more than 5-10% of people who are engaged in that kind of activity. But beyond that, you want for people at least to be interested, and there is a real sense of all sorts of reasons. Some of them good. So it's good, for example, that people might have an alternative to just consuming mainstream media. They may find more interesting and meaningful content elsewhere. It certainly provides a problem, and it's at least one of the arguments why there is, if you like, some space there for politicians like Farage. Now, of course, and this is a phenomenon that certainly widespread across Europe, and we're going to see a lot of evidence for that at the next Euro elections. But I think there are two responses to something like that with Farage. One, obviously, if you are a mainstream politician, is to try and crush him, to point out the fact that his policies are often contradictory, or perhaps that they're pretty unsavoury. But the other one is to think about why this so-called authentic politician who smokes and drinks has been able to at least engage with people and get their attention. And it's not because he's, you know, some social media genius. He's a very traditional politician in many ways, who works very much through mainstream media. But he manages to address issues that people care about in a way that somehow seems to get their attention in a way that other politicians are not able to. And of course the argument, is that just extremism, or is it because he's able to touch upon issues and concerns in a way that people find very relevant to their real lives? And I think in the same way, journalists can respond to the threat of the new. The whole rise of series of alternatives to mainstream media, social networks, blogs, online video, etc. You can either reject it, try and crush it, hold to your ramparts, or you can try and think about why is it that those platforms, those networks are able to get people's attention. So I think that is the real challenge. We could wait forever to have perfect politicians. We could wait forever to have perfect political journalists. But I think that hope, especially in the context of changing media and changing society is a hope that's sort of disappearing over a fast receding horizon. I think much more interesting is to ask what new opportunities are there, what new challenges are there afforded by new media technologies to enhance the role of media in its most general sense in politics in the UK. And that's what I'll be looking at next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if I can just begin with a question. The issue of whether the media and politicians, both very national, you've alluded to this, very national institutions. We have a centralised political system in the United Kingdom, certainly in England within the UK, and as you said, the media are extremely centred. They were centred on one street, but they're still centred within a small, within easy walking distance of this building. Now that has led some critics to argue that, in a sense, far from being a belligerent war of one against the other, that they are indeed all in it together, that they are, you did allude to this, that they're all in one power elite, which people like, and I realise you may be getting onto this next week, so forgive me if I'm treading on that, a blogger such as Paul Staines or Mike Smithson, who is politicalbetting.com, if you look at that, who says blogging from outside the Westminster Village, and Paul Staines, Guido Fawkes has definitely set himself up as battering the mainstream media as agents of this political system. I mean, what do you make of that criticism?
Well, I think it's true. What perhaps I didn't go into, because it's kind of the mechanics of it, is that it's almost a sort of necessary proximity. Well, it is a necessary proximity in the sense that certainly if we're talking about mainstream, parliamentary related, and most political journalism in Britain, I think, and this is a real criticism, is extraordinarily weighted to Westminster. That throughout my journalistic life, every year or so we would have a meeting about you hire a new political correspondent, and they would say, and what I'm going to do is get the agenda outside of the Westminster Village. I'm going to go up north and everything. And then they ended up dragged back to Westminster because that would be where the stories are. That you would be told about, who's in, who's out, what new policies are brewing, because that's where British politics is based. We just don't have, for example, in Germany, where obviously the strength of the Länder means that you do have a distributed political media.
And in the United States.
And in the United States, famously. Although, the White House press corps is an even more integrated, and the DC press corps is even more intensely in the same corridors as Westminster. So I think there's a sort of practical issue, and I'm not blaming the politicians, as it were, but until we have a political system which itself is more devolved, then that's going to be the case. And I think what's fascinating is, I don't know if there's any Scottish people here, or Welsh people, but what's been fascinating has been the failure. I thought that Scottish political journalism would blossom with devolution in Scotland. But if anything, it's declined. It's really interesting. And we're not entirely sure why. It's a whole series of things, partly economic, that when it was cut adrift from its sort of being subsidised, as it were, by Westminster, it's actually been diminished. And I don't mean to offend any Scottish journalists, but that, I think all of them agree that they just hasn't seen the rich flowering of political debate and reporting that people thought. So there is something odd about the economies of scale, if you like, around political media,
Right. Francesca, you had a question, I think. So just for the back, the question is that are the media, by their actions, forgive me if I got this wrong, desensitizing people and therefore promoting, as Lord Whitelaw, when he was a Conservative cabinet minister, memorably said, going around whipping up apathy, and are the media actually, by their behaviour, turning, Russell Brand's criticism, which has had a great deal of attention, because I think he would argue, and has argued, in fact there was a very interesting piece on Radio 4 done by an economist journalist the other night, taking the Russell Brand thesis seriously, that he is articulating a disconnect with the conventional political and media system, which the conventional system, doesn't know how to approach. So, in a sense, are the media complicit in switching people off, particularly, let's say, people who are less elderly off?
I think yes is the big answer, and it is somewhat preempting what we're going to look at next week, which is, is there, because that implies there's an alternative. And there's a couple of alternatives. One is to sort of force people to sit down and watch the 10 o'clock news every night, compulsory voting and all that kind of stuff, which I think would be disastrous. And that wouldn't work. So next week we're going to look at, are there other opportunities? But here's some interesting facts. Most political journalists, and when you said the media, I would differentiate. There is the media, which does everything, and politics is just one bit of it, what it does. And then there's the sort of political media. And again, referring back to the Sun newspaper, the Sun newspaper has as many political stories every day as any other newspaper. It's really interesting. Go and count them. It's really interesting how many they do. They have a Whitehall editor. They have a political team down there. And most of those people, if you talk to political journalists, they love politics. They love politics. They even quite like politicians, in the sense that they hate the one in they hate the one in front of them, but if they are interested in politics, that's why they're doing that job. Otherwise, they'd be the football correspondent or something, So they want people, and they want people desperately to read their copy or watch their TV. So whenever they do that, they're never doing it in a kind of deliberate or lazy way to put people off. And if you talk to terribly serious people like the lovely Nick Robinson, the BBC's political editor, he's fascinating on this, because if you watch Nick, go and watch him on the BBC bulletins, and he is straining every sinew to engage the disengaged British public, who are making their tea, doing the ironing, thinking about the football, scratching their arses. And he does everything he can to simplify, to make it dramatic, to break it down, to think of a clever metaphor, because Nick, as a former conservative activist and so on, is passionate about politics. So if there is a problem, it's not a lack of will. It's, I think, because, and this is what I started to allude to there, was a failure to, well, firstly, over-expectation. I think, and perhaps I'll be going into this next week more, that there's a myth of an informed society. You all here in a university believe deeply in the idea of education and being informed, but you're spending a fortune to be here if you're students, because you're exceptional. And so it's actually much more problematic around the idea of what we mean by an educated and informed public. How far do we want to go? What do we really mean by that? But certainly there's no lack of enthusiasm. I think it's about the language they use, the relevance to the area of the topics they choose. And again, this goes back to the sort of complicity bit or the diversity bit, which is that the journalists end up being obsessed by the same, often narrow range of issues that the politicians are, that generally speaking, even their political lives are much more diverse than the political agenda of, a parliamentary democracy and therefore a political press.
Anybody else like to? Yes, from the back there. So again, for those at the back, the question was why did the Cleggmania moment, which we saw photographed, or at least the occasion of it, or the creation of it in the leaders' debates, not follow through as it appeared to in the polls, but not much evidence it actually followed through to election day, or if it did, not at any massive scale.
It's a really good question. I think it's a really interesting comparison. I think, yes, I suspect that the UKIP thing is already waning somewhat. I think it's so many answers. Some of the answers will be better answered by the psephologists in the government department, who will show you that actually the rise in the Lib Dem ratings was never as high as people thought. A lot of it was about people in the immediate aftermath of the debates being asked, who do you think won the debate? And people were then translating that almost into seats won, when it was just, we think that guy was the nicest bloke out of those three chaps on the telly. And that was kind of being translated. So I think it was partly that there wasn't ever a Clegg mania moment. Then there were lots of interesting distorting impacts. And again, it slightly goes into next week's lecture, but things like social media. So there was that, what was it? I agree with Nick, hashtag on Twitter. You don't see many of those anymore. And that was a response to, why were there those I agree with Nick? It was partly because of the TV debates, but it was also because of the attacks upon him by the Daily Mail. So a bunch of journalists on the Daily Mail saw some of these polls, saw the stuff on Twitter, and thought, oh my God, this guy who's married to a foreigner, used to work for the European Union, might get to be Prime Minister. Little did they realise he would, Deputy Prime Minister at least, and therefore attacked him viciously. And there was a kind of backlash on lovely liberal Twitter. And how many people does Twitter represent? About 0.5% of the British population, you know. And so there were some interesting distorting media effects, partly because at that moment we'd never had TV debates before. You know, it was a learning experience for all concerned. And the parties bought the same shtick that the press did. They thought this was going to be the most important thing. So you couldn't get hold of press officers for days before the debates because they were so busy preparing for those debates. And so I think both the press and the politicians exaggerated their importance to the exclusion of anything else. And it did actually create a vacuum. So there weren't they cancelled. Parties used to do daily press briefings, press conferences. Every day they used to have massive press conferences. They abandoned them because they were doing the TV debates. It was fascinating, or largely abandoned them, you know. And I think, yes, it's a different thing. I mean, Farage hasn't won that attention because of an artifice like the TV debates. But I think he has, if you like, he's symbolically the Nick Clegg. He's the guy in the middle of all the others who somehow looks different. But I think the difference with him is that he is, when I say he's authentic, we can talk about that another time, it's a big word, but he is authentically bonkers. You know, he genuinely does hold to these completely contradictory ideas and is prepared to say something like, I don't care if I reduce immigration, I don't care if it screws the British economy. There are some things that are more important than money. Now, when did you last hear a politician ever say that? You know, so I think in some senses he's more robust than Clegg, who said, I am this ideal, perfect thing, and then cut to 2 years later he has to make a video saying, I'm sorry. You know, I can't imagine Farage ever saying, I'm sorry. So he's more robust, but I think his base is less strong, but that's a political issue rather than a media one.
I hear from the noise outside we must stop. It is indeed 6:30. Charlie, thank you very much, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot again.